Good evening to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our update on what is now Tropical Depression 2 and what will potentially become, very likely, it'll become Tropical Storm Beryl over the next several hours and potentially become an unusual early season, late June MDR hurricane that could potentially bring impacts to the islands as early as Sunday night and potentially into early next week. We have a lot to go over today, including the National Hurricane Center forecast, and it is quite a shocker, to say the least, with what they are forecasting. But trust me, when we take a look at the model guidance, you will not be surprised in the very bit in terms of what the National Hurricane Center is forecasting. So, really quickly, I just want to start off with a satellite shot of Tropical Depression 2. You can see it. One thing I need to note about this storm, and I think anybody in the hurricane tracking community can agree with me on this, this is probably the most healthy looking tropical cyclone you could get in the eastern central MDR, tropical Atlantic, for the calendar day of June 28th. This is really, you don't really see these kind of systems, especially this early on in the hurricane season. We have lots of deep convection blowing up, especially very close, if not right over the center of Tropical Depression 2. It is definitely organizing rapidly, and it is expected to continue to do so over the next day or two as it progresses closer towards the Windward Islands. The only really big issue I would say that is going to inhibit this is its forward speed and potentially that causing easterly shear because of the forward speed probably being different in terms of the trades below it, which will guide the storm westward, versus what the upper level winds will be, which does cause easterly shear. And that is a little bit of an issue that most of these early season MDR storms tend to deal with, but it is definitely trying to organize in spite of that. This is definitely a healthy system, lots of deep convection blowing up. It is all of the things that we want to see in a developing and potentially strengthening tropical cyclone. And once again, it is very likely to probably become Beryl. I'd imagine maybe even within the next update, which is at 11 o'clock. Not at 8 o'clock because there are no watches and warnings issued yet for this storm, but I'd imagine by 11 o'clock, this will probably be Tropical Storm Beryl. And definitely by tomorrow morning, if not 11 o'clock, we will have our second named storm of the hurricane season. So let's take a look at what it is doing right now, though. This was designated as of 5 o'clock this afternoon, and as of the 5 p.m. advisory, Tropical Depression 2 is 35 miles an hour. So tropical depression, minimum central pressure of 1,007 millibars, and if you are tracking it at its exact location, I know some of you are, 9.1 north is the latitude, and the longitude is 41.9 west, and it is moving west at 15 knots, which is 17 miles per hour, and it's going to continue to move west at a brisk pace, eventually shift slightly more towards a west-northwest sort of track as it goes on in time. Once again, going to make a beeline right towards the Windward Islands. And the National Hurricane Center cone actually shows this. Right now a tropical depression, although by tomorrow they're expecting this to become a tropical storm. And once again, I mentioned, wouldn't be surprised if it does so overnight. But then as we get into Sunday, they're expecting this to strengthen into a hurricane. They're actually pulling the gun with this potentially becoming a hurricane as it approaches the Windward Islands in the southern Caribbean on Monday. And it could actually be a pretty decent hurricane, not just a small minimal hurricane. No, we're not going to get that. We're actually expecting, at least by the National Hurricane Center, that this could be indeed an actual decent hurricane heading into the Caribbean, especially for this time of year in late June and early July, which, to be honest, we really don't even get hurricanes that typically develop in this part of the basin this early on, which just adds to the unusualness of this storm. It's not unprecedented that we've not ever seen a hurricane in the MDR in late June in the Atlantic, but it's just very, very unusual because it's only happened a handful amount of times, and it looks like, at least by the National Hurricane Center, this could be one of those times. But what's even more unusual is the intensity, and they actually have their intensity in the forecast discussion. And I wanted to show the forecast discussion not only for the intensity that they're forecasting, but very, very important and very, very interesting things that they mentioned as well in their forecast discussion at 5 o'clock. And if you want to read the full thing, just go to the National Hurricane Center homepage, and under the box for Tropical Depression 2, you'll see forecast discussion. And so if you want to read all of this in your own time, just do that. But I really want to read, especially from this paragraph here, which we will in a moment, but really quickly, what is the peak intensity that they forecast for Tropical Depression 2? Yeah, you're seeing that right. 105 miles an hour at hour 96. So that is roughly just after it actually enters the Caribbean. So roughly at this point right here is the 105 mile per hour forecast. They're actually expecting, though, that it'll still become a Category 2 before that. So right as it's entering the islands or moving through the islands, entering the Caribbean at hour 72, the National Hurricane Center is expecting 100 miles per hour as they're strengthening into Category 2. So generally, bottom line, they're expecting Tropical Depression 2 to potentially become a Category 2. That kind of rhymes actually a little bit. But anyways, enough with the joking. It is actually pretty serious because, once again, it is very, very unusual for this time of year. And they actually mention it in their discussion. They mention typically the atmospheric environment is unfavorable for intensification in this portion of the Atlantic Basin in late June. We all know that climatology, and I actually talked about climatology if you were tuned into this afternoon's midday update video that I did earlier on today. We talked about climatology and how it's typically unfavorable in the deep tropical Atlantic, especially this far out where Tropical Depression 2 is for late June and even for the early season as a whole. However, the overall atmospheric and oceanic conditions appear conducive for steady strengthening over the next few days. Accordingly, the official forecast calls for strengthening and shows the depression becoming a tropical storm tonight, as I mentioned, or early Saturday, then a hurricane before it reaches the Windward Islands. And this is really the interesting part that they actually mentioned, and I'm really surprised by this, and it's quite shocking, I think, to anybody. But it should be noted that some of the model guidance is quite aggressive and a fair amount higher than the official forecast, which basically means that some of the model guidance, especially the hurricane models and even the GFS now, are hinting that potentially this storm could become a major hurricane as it approaches the islands. And they actually do say that, for example, the hurricane regional models show this system becoming a major hurricane, and the GFS model shows this system deepening below 970 millibars prior to reaching the Windward Islands. And this is especially noted as of the 18Z run of the GFS. So that means all of the models are very much latching on to potentially this storm strengthening quite a bit as it heads towards the islands and as it enters the Eastern Caribbean. And it is very much an interesting thing to be seeing this, especially in late June and early July. It's only happened a handful of times. And the intensity guidance, as I mentioned too, is very much reflective of what the National Hurricane Center is mentioning. This is really something that is noteworthy. And it really is not hype when we're talking about potentially a hurricane threat to the Caribbean islands, because at least as of the 18Z model intensity guidance, you could see the general model spread. You don't really need to be somebody that is so meteorologically well sound in terms of being able to read this graph. All you need to know is that most of the model guidance, only a handful of them, I should point out, do not make Tropical Depression 2 a hurricane, and that's really only like 4 models. You could actually count them out. And the rest of the models, majority of them, have the model spread into this becoming at least hurricane strength starting around the next 48 to 72 hours, so the next 2 to 3 days, which does actually line up with this storm approaching the Leeward Islands around the Lesser Antilles around this time, which would be, Sunday into Monday. So that does fall right in line with that. And they also mentioned the GFS2. GFS seems to strengthen this into a Cat 2. And then they also mentioned the hurricane models. Really quickly, I could already point off the bat, the H-Wharf and the H-Mon model, which is these two right here. Both of them strengthen above category 2 strength. Actually, quite a bit of the models actually strengthen this storm to at least category 3 intensity. And that is quite alarming, especially given, once again, we're in late June, and it just goes to show how favorable things are. Although I will say, and I will point a caveat out, that the GFS obviously does tend to be over aggressive, and especially these hurricane models without recon, sometimes they can overinflate storms and their intensity. We've seen it happen multiple times, but I think it's definitely an interesting thing as well that we have the National Hurricane Center mentioning these models that are strengthening it into a major hurricane. And I think that definitely goes to show the conditions that are ahead of this system. So we talked about the intensity guidance. Let's actually take a look at what the models show. Starting off with the GFS for the 18Z. I'll just leave it at this. Why not? So here's the 18Z run. GFS obviously consolidates the system further in the next 24 hours. It's already a strengthening system below 1,000 millibars. Take that out into time, roughly hour 72. This is right over the Caribbean islands. So this is Monday afternoon, 18Z. So if you want an exact time, that's 2 p.m. Eastern time on the East Coast. And look at that, 964 millibars right over this system heading into the Caribbean. That's probably at least Cat 2 strength, maybe even major hurricane strength as well. And then after that, moves into the Eastern Caribbean. GFS does this thing where it kind of brings this very close to Hispaniola. I guess it interacts with it. And then at 5 days, it moves over, and then it continues on into the Caribbean. Don't want to focus much, though, past hour 120. Obviously, one, because the National Hurricane Center cone does not go past 5 days. And also, they also mentioned their discussion to that things, especially around days 3 to 5, get very dicey when it comes to the forecast spread. So there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding it, and I really focus in especially on just the next 3 to 5 days, given that within that time frame, we're obviously going to have an impact on the islands to civilization. This storm will be impacting someplace and bringing impacts to people within the next 3 days. So I really wouldn't focus too much past it. Once we get past the Eastern Caribbean, then I would worry about whether or not we would see impacts to the rest of the Caribbean, or even impacts or implications for what weather will be potentially for the United States. But that is way too far out right now, and I just want to point that out first and foremost before anything else. So we have that in the GFS, and then obviously 5 days out too, after we deal with Depression 2, probably going to be Beryl within the next several hours. As I did mention earlier on in the day with my previous video update, yes, we do have another area that the GFS shows that tries to develop and become a tropical cyclone. I guess the GFS may be aggressive, maybe not. We'll have to see how it does with Depression 2. But that it looks like it's good. It looks like another threat for the Caribbean. It's just quite incredible how active things are getting as we're heading into the end of June into early July. But if you've been tracking how things have been progressing over the last several weeks and months with the Atlantic, you would know that honestly none of this is really that surprising, given the Atlantic is just really favorable. And speaking of favorability, let's take a look at what the GFS shows in terms of the upper level pattern. And this is really why the GFS is really aggressive on this storm, because notice first and foremost over the next 18 to 24 hours, as I mentioned actually right now, as of 18Z, you could see we're in light winds, but you do notice that there is an easterly flow in the upper levels. So there's that, but there's also a stronger easterly flow in the lower levels. And obviously there's a little bit of an easterly shear component, but the winds do remain light. And very, very importantly, you notice what happens is the airflow starts moving away from the system, not only to the east, but to the north, because we start getting this upper level anticyclone that develops over Tropical Depression 2. And eventually it situates itself well enough that it causes this storm to strengthen continuously right up until it gets to the islands, and then right at hour 72, basically when it's on approach to the islands. Look at this. This is actually a very, very favorable look for intensification. The airflow moving away from the east, away to the north, and even in other places as well. This is outflow, really well pronounced outflow in the 200 millibar level of the atmosphere, because and this is all important, and I'm going to explain to you why am I pointing this out, because if we have a really pronounced outflow channel like the GFS is showing here, this means that the storm will be able to breathe well, and it'll be able to breathe out, basically imagining that you're breathing in and then you're breathing out, and you need to breathe out because you have a whole bunch of air inside of you that otherwise you'll suffocate, right, if you don't breathe the air out. Basically, just think about it as that with tropical cyclones. They need to breathe in, and then they also need to breathe out. And outflow, which is air leaving a tropical cyclone in the upper levels, that is a tropical cyclone breathing out. And the easier it's able to breathe out, the more it is able to intensify, and the stronger it is able to become. And especially with the very warm sea surface temperatures that it has below it, which I'm actually going to show you in this next tab, it just makes things that much more favorable. So that's the GFS. Then there's the European, which also develops this storm as well. All the models develop this. Well, actually, I should not say develop, because it is already a tropical depression. Sorry, sometimes I forget things a little bit, but the European also does strengthen depression too a little bit. Although it does not make it a very strong storm, it makes it more or less a weak to moderate tropical storm on approach to the islands. And this, I guess, the European represents a good fail mode for the storm. If things don't necessarily exactly go right for tropical depression too, because we notice, yes, there is easterly flow in the upper levels of the atmosphere, but you notice, especially as it approaches the islands, the upper level airflow doesn't really quite establish itself as well as the GFS. Let's really quickly compare hour 72 on the European to what it shows at hour 66 on the GFS, and notice lots of outflow to the east, and it also has a really good channel kind of going to the north as well. And it is very strong, pretty pronounced, if you ask me, on the 200 millibar level on the GFS. And then on the European, on the other hand, not really as much pronounced outflow. The European is not really situating, not 95L. It's now tropical depression too. It was 95L earlier. But the European is not really situating this storm as well with its outflow channel. So I guess some more easterly shear is able to get into this storm, and that's a potential fail mode. And that actually is a fail mode as to why a lot of the times we would get these systems in the early season. If you remember, especially Tropical Storm Brett of last year, I actually think this storm is very similar to Brett. A lot of the models showed this really potentially becoming a hurricane, especially as it would approach the islands of the Caribbean. And the National Hurricane Center even predicted that Brett would become a hurricane as well. And it almost did, actually. But there was a component of easterly shear which kept the storm from intensifying further than what it could have, because especially in the Atlantic this time of year, it's just a natural part of climatology that the trades are strong, and we really need a good upper level air pattern for a storm to be able to overcome those trades, especially this time of year, so it can intensify and intensify like the models show. And the European doesn't quite necessarily show that. Does show the outflow kind of becoming a little bit better defined as it enters the Caribbean, so it does intensify it a little bit, but eventually down the line that kind of leads to its detriment, because it runs into wind shear issues as it gets into the central and western Caribbean. So that's the European. And then let's really quickly just speed run through all the hurricane models really quickly before they enter the Caribbean. This is actually the 18Z that's running, so I'm going to put the 12Z, because the 18Z is not entirely loaded yet. But this is H-Wharf, develops the storm, intensifies this really quickly. Very favorable atmosphere that the H-Wharf shows. I think the H-Wharf, all the hurricane models run on a very similar sort of initialization to the GFS. So explains why the GFS and the hurricane models are really much in agreement with this storm. But at hour 72, into Monday afternoon, you can see the H Wharf develops Tropical Depression 2. Still has it as 95L on the model, but it's officially Tropical Depression 2. But they have it as a hurricane entering the Caribbean, moves through the Windward Islands. Looks like the biggest impact area is Barbados, I think. And then I think this is St. Lucia, and this is St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That H Wharf really brings the storm over, and you can see the intensity 81 knots, so that's a category 1 that the H Wharf has, and it brings us into the Caribbean, and it rapidly intensifies, and the H Wharf makes this into a hurricane, really strong hurricane, in fact, although this is getting towards 5 days. But the H Wharf makes this into a mid-range category 4 as it enters the Caribbean. But as for the islands, it's a category 1, so that's the H Wharf. Category 1 into the islands. The HMON has to become a category 3. The HMON is really aggressive on the storm, and I think this is probably a little bit too aggressive, but they also show a hurricane into the islands. HMON shows a category 3, borderline category 4, pressure of 957 millibars as it's moving into the islands. On the 18Z, actually, so the 18Z is fully loaded on the HMON. Once again, I think this is probably way, way too aggressive. Oh, what did I do? I actually made it run. This is way too aggressive, but the bottom line is that the H-Wharf and both the HMON show this becoming a hurricane. What about the HAFS model, though? Let's see what they show. Also a hurricane into the Caribbean, roughly the same strength as the GFS, so 81 knots, so that's mid-range category 1. So that's that as it's entering the Caribbean at 80 hours. And then let's see what the HAFS-B does. Basically does the same. Oh no, the HAFS-B is on the HMON's sort of realm, and it makes this a major hurricane as it approaches the islands. But taking its intensity aside, the intensity part is really going to matter over the next several hours and over the next day or so. How Tropical Depression 2 develops tomorrow, how it's able to deal with easterly shear, the trades, if it's able to overcome the trades like the models, like all these models are showing. Otherwise, they wouldn't really show. I wouldn't imagine that they wouldn't be showing them as strong as they are showing. And definitely how much it's able to take advantage of the general environment this storm is in is really all going to depend. It's really going to depend on how it's really going to play into a factor, I should say, into how strong this storm will be as it approaches the islands. And that's the other part I want to talk about is the environment that it has atmospherically. We talked about the atmospheric part, and we talked about, obviously, the GFS showing a very favorable upper level pattern. But what about the oceanic aspect of this? And right through the southern Caribbean, if you look right through the southern MDR into the Caribbean, this is the sea surface temperature anomaly map by the NOAA Coral Reef Watch. So basically the departures from normal of the sea surface temperatures, and they're all easily at least a degree Celsius. They are at least a solid degree to even 2 degrees Celsius above normal throughout all the southern MDR and into the Caribbean. And this is just, obviously, this is all part of the ocean, and the oceans take a while to change in terms of their energy, and especially with this kind of energy we have in the MDR, it's definitely going to take multiple storms, multiple sort of hurricanes that we get to really take all this energy out of the ocean and kind of return the balance of Mother Nature, which is why I and many other people are saying that all this is happening right now is all definitely a sign of this hurricane season, of things to come this hurricane season, because it is just very warm through the MDR. I'm really going to quickly show you again. That is very warm. Look at all those oranges and reds. I don't think you guys need to be smart to know that that is a very warm look throughout the MDR. It is not hype, that is for damn sure. These are actual products, and these are all by the NOAA. I don't think they would try to skew this map in any sort of way to kind of present some sort of agenda. I know that there are definitely people that feel that way and have that sort of distrust with products like this because they're produced like agencies like NOAA. But trust me, the Atlantic is very warm. These maps are definitely real. They're definitely indicative of the environment that is out there right now, not only atmospherically, but oceanically, and they're all going to play very crucially into Tropical Depression 2 as it heads through those sea surface temperatures in the MDR, and obviously plays in with the atmosphere that it'll have too, and it'll really be interesting to see how much Tropical Depression 2 is able to strengthen over the next several days as it enters the Caribbean. And we'll see if all these models are right. Maybe this might be a major hurricane into the Eastern Caribbean as it's approaching the islands. And if that's the case, then that is definitely more likely than not going to be a sign of things to come this hurricane season, because it is only a handful of seasons that we would get something like this. I think 1933 was the last time we really got a situation like this where we had a hurricane this early in the MDR, with the Trinidad and Tobago hurricane of that year. And 1933, by the way, was the most active hurricane season on record in terms of it producing the most amount of accumulated cyclone energy. And the only season that has come close to that since is 2005. So definitely very interesting statistics. And obviously the past does not dictate the future. But I'd imagine it definitely is a sign of things to come and things to watch out for as we get towards later this season if the Atlantic is as warm as it is. And now we're seeing the fruit of it, and I'll continue to say it, and it's really fascinating that now we're actually seeing the fruit of the really favorable Atlantic coming into play this year. And it's definitely going to make a long hurricane season ahead, let alone a probably very long weekend ahead and probably very long week next week, especially if these model intensity guidance plots that are being put out right now by the models do verify. It's all going to be very interesting for sure. And I really do hope that if you haven't already, that you comment or subscribe. If you like what you saw today, I would really encourage you. And if you really, most importantly, found my videos informative, I would really encourage you to like, comment, subscribe, share with family and friends, especially for those that need the information that live in these islands, or even if you live in these islands as well. I'll definitely be posting updates throughout the weekend, probably going to do at least 2 or 3 videos per day from now till this storm impacts the islands, and probably going to continue that further as well, especially if this holds well into the Caribbean. So I really encourage you to do that. Keep an eye on to the tropics. If you're in the area that is at risk right now, if you're especially in the cone, and even if you're just outside the cone, this storm will be a small compact storm, as I did mention, but impacts are not limited to what the hurricane cone shows. The impacts spread wide out from the center of the storm. The cone only represents the point of where the center could possibly move in. And definitely if you're within the cone, and even generally throughout the entire Lesser Antilles this weekend, definitely begin your preparations now. And monitor the tropics over the next 2 days as things progress. And they're definitely going to be interesting, and you'll definitely want to stay tuned. So with that being said, not going to stress more about it tonight, because obviously there's a whole bunch of emotion probably surrounding about this, and we cannot always be dwelling on it 24/7. So I'm not going to do that to you anymore. So as soon as you're done watching this, obviously get off. Do your hurricane preparations now, so you don't have to worry about them till Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening, right when the storm is about to approach. Get them done now. Notify others that are in the path. And with that being said, stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to you all. We'll definitely talk again soon. And most importantly, for updates at any time, when I'm not doing a video or when I'm not doing a live stream, because I will be doing those as well starting tomorrow, stay tuned for my Twitter page, because I'll post updates on there too. reposting things I find interesting, and also giving my information on whenever the new model guidance comes out. I'll probably be doing that as well throughout tonight, into tomorrow morning. So stay tuned for that, as well. With that being said, again, stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to you all. Keep an eye onto the tropics. Till then, we'll talk again soon.